Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge Podcast with me, Paul Busby, and as ever with Goff Morgan. Hello, Goff.
Hello all. Greetings to you. All
You know,
perky?
you know that first bit, which is the same every single video. It's not scripted, you know.
But no,
Oh,
no,
it's
no, we're just naturals. We're naturals. That's the thing.
naturally repetitive. Yeah. So how are you, Goff? How's things?
Fine and dandy. Coping on. Getting on with it all. Trying to work out where you can and cannot have a drink and at what time. Just for background filler, I'm sure you just would like to know about our personal lives. You're guaranteed that when Paul and I do something, they immediately shut it down instantly afterwards.
Yeah.
So for the first time since the 25th of February, we went out and had an evening beer. Week later, you can't do it anymore.
Didn't think we were that bad.
Well, I know. I don't know that. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought we would have, damaged the whole hospitality sector. But frankly,
Well, different people, different areas have different problems. We're thinking about that, and I'm sure our English viewers, if we have any, we might have one or two, maybe. They're trying to work out what a substantial meal is at the moment.
Yeah.
I suppose. But anyway,
say a single Scotch egg would not be considered substantial in my book.
No.
I would require more than a single Scotch egg.
But you might be watching this in the future when everything has turned out brilliantly. So, and we don't do current events here. Current events for us is about the 16th century, quite frankly. This is today because we're doing
as we get.
St Julian's house. Now, Goff, if you're anything like me, St Julian's is a very familiar part of the world, but St Julian's house was not terribly familiar for me.
No, all I know about it is its sad end. I knew it had existed, that I knew that it came to a very dramatic conclusion. And that was about it. I'm aware, that's right. I think that bottom road that runs along the side of the River Usk into Clean, where there's a toll road at the end, I think did that run over the St Julian's estate at one point? Was that how it came to be?
That red mark, which I've helpfully put on the screen, is where St Julian's house used to be. So it is now the present-day Marina Court in St Julian.
Oh, right.
So for anyone who needs their bearings, I guess you need to be from Newport to have any bearings at the moment anyway, or Killeen. There we are. So here is the main bit of St Julian's here. We've got St Julian's School around here somewhere. There we go. And then we go up, and there it is.
So where's Killeen? Where's Killeen Road? Oh, there's the River Usk on the corner there. Oh, right. All right. So it's further. So it's nearer the junction of the M4 roundabout than I thought. That's interesting. I always thought it was further up around the corner.
No, its situation is interesting because in the extremely old days that we'll be talking about, not to get academic about it, but the old days, there are records which try to put St Julian's into Killeen.
Oh, yeah. Oh, right.
So it's not a million miles away, is it?
No, well, no.
So that's
Killeen Road. You can see Killeen Road is just there. Oh, interesting. Very, very, very interesting.
But the whole name for this entire area, St Julian's, comes from a martyred saint, not St Julian, but St Julius.
Right.
St Julius and Aaron and with St Albans, or St Albans gets all the credit and all the fame, but there were three named martyrs in Roman Britain for Christianity. Those three: Julius, Aaron, and St Albans. Now, Gildas mentions St Julius and Bede mentions St Julius, and we know by a land charter in the 9th century there was a chapel to St Julius which may have contained his remains near Killeen.
Oh,
it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How this got its name. Well, even more so when you read a description of an old barn that used to be right next to St Julian's house. Now, it says, this is Cox's historical tour of Monmouthshire from 1801. So he sees this barn and he writes, near the house is an old barn of small dimensions. On the south wall are the remains of an arched entrance, which is now half filled up. The east and west windows may be traced, and a small Gothic doorway to the left still remains in its original state. The barn contains stone reliefs and also marble.
Oh, that's unusual for a barn, surely, to go. Yes, marble in a barn?
But what isn't unusual is for a chapel to be converted into a barn.
Yeah. When you were describing it, it sounds like a chapel, doesn't it? It very, very much sounds like a chapel.
So it may very well be.
I wonder.
And indeed,
the lost chapel of St Julius.
Indeed, it is assumed by a lot of people that the Herberts built their house on the site of the chapel of St Julius, or as the first chap, Sir George Herbert, who was the third son of the first Earl of Pembroke. Okay, so it's a third son's house. He sets up there, and in initial documents, he calls it St Julian's. So completely missing the mark. St Julian's.
St Julian. Oh, bless
there
her.
We know where we are now, right? We know where we are.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
But the first major person to be here that sort of leaves any kind of mark on the area is where we get into the sort of time of Queen Mary and the early Elizabethan age. Oh, I guess Henry VIII as well, he would have been there. Was Sir Walter Herbert. Now, he went into battle with Henry VIII on one of his campaigns, where it says here, he took 100 of the finest archers in the county, many of whom were said to be freeholders. So it was almost gentleman archers company from Monmouthshire heading off to battle. But what's good about Sir Walter is, and your ears will prick up with this, Goff, he was described as a wild man. Tough, rough, and a patron and protector of thieves and murderers. He was mixed up with some disreputable characters in Maga. Now,
there were several, I'm led to believe.
No. As we know now, there are no disreputable characters in Maga. And to defend the Maga of the 1530s and 1540s, the population of Maga would have been so small that the number of disreputable people they're counting were nearly all the Herberts' retinue that went there. So they take over the very small village of Maga back then. So Sir Walter Herbert is a tough character. He's running wild, essentially. Does that ring true with you of what you know about the Herberts in Newport of this era, the 1530s, Goff?
Oh, yes. Well, you've got to remember that the ruling families at this point, they weren't as established as they were in the latter part of the 19th century, that oligarchy we've been talking about a lot recently. They were essentially ganglands. They were gangland bosses. So William Herbert running this sort of wild crew of rapscallions and murderers and thugs is entirely within the keeping of the way it is. So I mean, if you consider, at the similar time, some of the Tredegar estates had piracy operating off it and not cooperating with pirate inquiries because they were raiding shippers in Bristol, but also they were you operated in a almost lawless environment. An awful lot of these families were the squires and the squirearchy of the area, which are essentially king's representatives. But the law wasn't really operating in any great degree. I mean, they had tax collecting powers, but frequently the tax came into their properties and never went out of it again. So I mean, they were crooks, basically, organized crime. The way it sort of operated. And the Herberts always butted up against the Morgan family, the cadet branch, particularly of the Morgan family, with whom they banged heads for a very, very long time. Let me just check my names and dates on this one. William Morgan of Pencoed and his brother George ap Morgan.
Pencoed has come up before on here, hasn't it, Goff?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Pencoed, yes, quite, yeah. Now, William Morgan, George ap Morgan was the deputy steward of the lordship of Newport, and the Herberts are actually later lords of the manor of Newport as well. I don't think one of them got the head cut off. And it was his duty to actually seize goods on behalf of the king. And one of the Herberts family servants, a guy called John Cecil, lost all his goods, had all his goods forfeited, because basically he was convicted of murder. So we're getting back into the murdering bit that's going on in the background. Yeah. So obviously, George ap Morgan goes in, seizes all of Cecil's goods, which really aggravated Walter Herbert, who tried to resist the seizure, as it was said. And they basically just sort of started to scrap together. And there was a direct clash that occurred on the Trinity Sunday in Newport in 1533, came known as the Trinity Sunday riot. And basically, the sort of the Morgans and the crew were descending Stow Hill area when they caught a sight of one of the Morgan's dogs behaving in what can only be described as a frankly over-familiar way with one of their dogs, which the Herberts saw were absolutely hilarious. So George ap Morgan goes in and attempts to, so we say, uncouple the hounds, which I thought was a very delicate way of putting it. And there was a scrap basically broken. There was a bit of shoving. George ap Morgan claimed that he was stabbed with a dagger by William Herbert. Herbert claimed that he'd been assaulted by George ap Morgan, and they went in. So basically, they all, after this argy-bargy on Trinity, they retire to their various estates. And then a few days later, they just all pile back into the town of Newport with servants, retainers, followers, all sorts of things. Virtually a couple of hundred people each. 2 armed bands of Herberts and Morgans roll into the middle of town. And the whole town things just escalate. It becomes something of a turf war. There's a battle. There's fight. The town eventually gets completely and utterly wrecked. So eventually, even Sir William Morgan, who was down at Tredegar House, who was supposed to be the more respectable branch of it, apart from the piracy business, he piled in, and he was supposed to be one of the people who was supposed to be keeping peace in Gwent. So he actually piled in to it as well. So again, the town was destroyed. But at the subsequent inquiry over a dog, over a misbehaving dog, and basically at the subsequent inquiry, neither the Herberts or the Morgans could sort of remember how it had happened, how the town fell down around them. They couldn't really remember. It was a sort of, I knew there was a bit of shoving, but that was about it. So eventually it wound up in Star Chamber, but we're not really sure what the outcome of it actually was, because the documents haven't actually survived. But it went right up to one of the highest courts in the land about it, because eventually we know that the burgesses and inhabitants of Newport complained because as a result of the variances between the Morgans and the Herberts, armed men were daily assembling in the town, putting the inhabitants in fear of their lives and deterring the inhabitants of the surrounding lordships from coming to market there. So basically, this was Dodge City in the middle of the 1530s in Newport. You've got 2 armed gangs continually scrapping it at each other in the middle of the town. Notionally, the 2 ruling families, basically, these are the 2, the lordship owners of the town. And you often wonder why the town of Newport didn't develop beyond the size of a population of 1,000 until about 1800. I mean, you're not going to go, we say about, the Newport's only worried when you can't get in the market. But it wasn't so much that, it's the fact that your town, it couldn't develop because it was just too wild. It was really wild. And it's, down to them. That's all I know about them.
Well, that is... it's extraordinary over a dog, isn't it? I mean, we shouldn't be surprised now you've given the context, because it started with the murder of a servant, so it started serious.
Oh no, it started with the seizing of the goods of a servant who was a murderer. It's even more complicated. But again, you just can't think of these people as being respectable aristocrats. They weren't. Yeah. No. You've got the Capo di Capo, who is the Morgan. Then you had these cadet branches of Morgans, which is our William Morgan that we're talking about today at Pencoy, and the Herbert family. They were still intermarrying everybody left, right, and centre. That's another thing about it, because at one point I think Herberts were heir to some of the Morgan properties, and 2 of them died young, and 1 died mysteriously of eating poisoned food.
I shall make sure that is not mysterious later on. I shall give you the truth behind that.
Oh, cool. Oh, cool. I look forward to that one.
So we always have poison, don't we, Goff? I mean, this is...
Poison is one of our motifs. We seem to be very good at it in this part of the world.
Very good poison. Well, by the way, the image that's appeared on the screen was to try and highlight what you said, because this is actually the tomb of Sir Walter Herbert. He died in 1551, and this is in St Woolas Cathedral.
Oh, goodness me. Well.
So the Herbert in St Woolas Cathedral is Sir Walter Herbert of St Julian's. He's been knocked about a bit, but from what you've said, he was probably knocked about a bit in life as well.
Yeah. Didn't some of the parliamentarians knock a lot of the statues around in St Woolas Church? during the Civil War.
That's what's said, yeah. I mean, Sir John ap Morgan, for instance, and yeah, it said that.
Yeah.
But however, even though he is knocked about, it's still a very fine example of a Renaissance tomb in this part of the world.
Yeah, the tomb's lovely. The tomb hasn't been damaged much at all. It's the figure on it, isn't it?
I don't know if it's a last victory for the Herberts, but there's more of the Herberts tomb left than the Morgan tomb in St Wallace Cathedral. So one last Herbert victory, perhaps.
Yeah. The motif of little motif on it of two dogs being a little bit over.
They should be. Now there is also, you said about the whole gangland boss side of things, and that's absolutely right. But Sir Walter Herbert's sons do show a mercantile skill as well. Now remember, St Julian's house is on the banks of the River Usk, isn't it? A navigable river. So, and they exploit this to make money. Quite impressively. We know, because of various wills, that Sir Walter passed on to his sons a ship called James. There was also a ship called Le Stephen and the Green Dragon. Now, we know that the Green Dragon transgressed the Queen's regulations every time it left port, evading custom tolls. So some things don't change. We also know that Sir Walter's, that one of the sons was particularly good. He imported wine and had a cellar at Culzean where he kept salt. So there is a suggestion of the Herberts trying to make a bob or two at this time and exploiting the geographical location of St Julian.
Well, also, I think, I'm sure you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Culzean was actually the larger settlement at this point anyway. And it did have quite a major sort of dockland area and portland area up there, because it was the highest, really, one of the highest navigable points on the river at that point.
Yeah, there's a reason.
So it was much bigger than the town of Newport, which was.
Well, there's certainly a reason why they've got their cellar or warehouse in Culzean rather than Newport. Yeah, but let's change tone ever so slightly, and push on to a chap who was there in the 1570s, 80s, and 90s. Looking slightly startled. Maybe his ruff is too tight.
Yes. He's had a rough accident, as they call it. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I'm glad he's here with his... I'm glad he's looking slightly uptight, because he was in real life, and I'm glad his coat of arms is there, because he adored and worshipped his coat of arms and never let anyone forget how terribly important Sir William Herbert of St Julian's was. He was described as being learned and of a very high mind. Indeed, he studied under the president of Magdalen College, Oxford. Didn't go to Oxford, but studied privately under the president of Magdalen. And he was a Protestant, sort of very zealous in his Protestantism. But it shows how you make accommodations if a bride brings money into the family, because he married Florence Morgan of Llantarnam Abbey. Now, Llantarnam are the Catholic branch of the Morgan family.
Oh, right. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realise that.
So a zealous Protestant.
I knew that. I didn't realise they were they remained Catholic, because the Morgans were Protestant, weren't they?
Yeah. The Llantarnams at this time were very Catholic branch of the family. And what he did was, he said he wanted three things in his life to be a success, okay? To honour his God and to honour his prince. He wanted to produce volumes of his work, which he did, Latin and theological texts he produced. He wanted to produce his own college. Sadly, he died before that could happen, but he was going to set one up in his name, funded by him at Tintern, but it didn't happen.
Oh, gosh, that's interesting.
But he wanted to have his own colony, which he did, because Sir William Herbert was a plantation owner in Ireland. They'd confiscated acreage from an Irish peer, and he was given 13,276 acres in Munster, and he was appointed vice president of Munster. So he leaves St Julian's, moves to Ireland, and he takes this sort of reforming zeal because he wants to try to convert them. Now, it is quite interesting because he denounced the tyranny of the other plantation owners when he was over there. Denounced the tyranny. He wanted to replace the English garrison of troops with a Monmouthshire garrison of troops, which he adored, apparently. He translated some of the Anglican service into Irish, so the local people would understand it. And this sort of way of looking at it And he also, but there was also that of trying to implant his sort of English and Welsh values onto Ireland. I mean, the castle there, he had tapestries, and he had gold and silver plate, and he had an orchard, and he had, he was producing an Elizabethan English palace into Ireland. But he ruffled a few feathers, as you can imagine, with this.
Yeah.
And the other plantation owners there denounced his fat conceit and his Welsh humour. A lot of people have had a go at you, Gough, over the years for your Welsh humour.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's been a bane of my professional life.
So William had enough, really. He's had enough of all of this. His plan didn't really work, so a bit downhearted, comes back to St Julian's in the 1580s, and he becomes a member of Parliament. And he has an interesting little thing, actually, as a member of Parliament. He railed against Mary, Queen of Scots in 1586. And in Parliament, he basically called for her execution. And that is the first recorded speech by a Welsh member of Parliament in the House of Commons Journal.
Oh, gosh.
That was Sir William Herbert of St Julian's. And
that might have been that's a rather dangerous speech to make with Queen Mary as well, isn't it, really?
Oh, no, this was later. This is in the time of Elizabeth.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. Lot safer then.
Basically,
Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah.
Oh, I got my Marys mixed up. I beg your pardon.
Oh, he didn't burn or anything. No, no, this was way after this. No, this is 1586.
Right.
So he's done this. So that's something, isn't it? And he gets friendly, very friendly. In fact, he moves to Mortlake to be close to this man with, let's have a look at him, known as the Queen's Conjurer, according to one book, Dr. John Dee, who you see here. Now, for someone who doesn't know anything about Dr. John Dee, Gough, tell us who he was.
Now John Dee is one of those figures that are constantly referred to and seeped, if you like, into popular fiction and popular culture as a magician, a sorcerer, an alchemist, basically on the fringes of the mad worlds of Elizabethan, society. He was a sort of an astrologer, somebody given to divination, communication with angels in the language of Enoch, the Enochian language, and this, that, and the other. So he's come down as that. But however, he was a fantastically intelligent man. He was a mathematician. He was involved in navigation. He was a promoter of colonies, particularly within the New World. Part Welsh. Let me just bring up some of my little notes so I can see where we are. He was part Welsh. Let me just check. I believe, Welsh descent from a Roland Dee, who was of Welsh descent. And Dee, which is spelled D-E-E, comes from the black word D-U, D in Welsh, which means black. His grandfather was Bedo Ddi of Nantagroes, Pylchech Radnorshire. And he maintained that he was really quite proud of his sort of Welsh connection. He had various, like anybody who was Welsh at the time, produced pedigrees which claimed that they had descent from the Welsh princes, etc., all the way down. I think to Howell Var they went back to. He went off to King Edward's Grammar School, as it is now, which was in Chelmsford Chantry School, 1535. He entered John's College, Cambridge, in 1542 at the age of 15. And he actually graduated a Bachelor of Arts at the age of 18. He became a Fellow at Trinity College on its foundation by Henry VIII. So his man was a very, very respectable academic. He had a massive personal library. During the time of Queen Mary, he was interested in preserving old books. He was a book antiquary. Manuscripts and records, and was pushing for the foundation of a national library, essentially, what you think of as the British Library today. He was that far ahead. Nobody was interested at the time and didn't take it up. But his personal collection of stuff within Mortlake was enormous.
I did hear once, Gough, somebody gave a talk on Dee and said that at one time, wherever he travelled, he liked to take his books with him. And at one point, he ordered about over 1,000 books to go with him on a journey. I'm not sure how you arranged that, but no man in history has been more in need of a Kindle than Dr. John Dee.
Quite right, yes. But the fact that he had 1,000 books at this period is absolutely astonishing. I doubt if there were some academic institutions that had that number of books.
No, they said other than some
Incredible.
universities, he had the greatest library in the land.
Yeah, and those are just the ones he took with him. You know, so he wrote many important works. He was again, like a lot of people, he was an astrologer to Elizabeth. But we have to remember that the way they viewed things at this period, astrology was considered a science, not as we see it, you know, possibly a pseudoscience. But we got to remember, in their mindset in this period, there is no separation into what you consider as natural and supernatural. That is a separation which comes post-Enlightenment, really, when essentially post-Enlightenment you have science and superstition, and everything that superstition is dismissed. It's interesting that it's actually many of these things which are superstitions have still survived even into the 21st century. But for him to be involved in things, you know, on one hand, a major mathematician who had actually sort of lectured in Paris universities and this and the other, to have gone off and studied astrology, was not considered extraordinary in any way. He wrote major books on Hermeticism, which is an occult theory, typified by the statement of as above, so below. So basically, they believe that if the heavens could influence you, then you could influence heavens. It was a two-way track. But as the years went on, I mean, he fell a little bit out of favor because his pushing to actually go off and found and colonies and perform calendar revisions and all sorts of things just wasn't really picked up on. Political patronage didn't really result. So he ended up sliding more and more into what he considered his supernatural studies, his occult studies, because he believed that if he could use a scria, or somebody that looked into a crystal ball or a bowl of water or highly polished surface, then these screas could divine knowledge and act as an intermediary between himself and the angels, because he believed that what the best thing he could do was actually contact via the Enochian language and bring about a sort of unity of sciences in a sort of pre-apocalyptic utopia, which he could bring about. Now, this is where it all goes ever so slightly wrong for Dee, because in 1582, we met a guy called Edward Kelly, who was a scria. Edward Kelly at the time was going under the name of Edward Talbot because he was disguising a conviction for forgery. So you're not dealing with perhaps the most reliable person under Edward Kelly. And Kelly then became the principal channel by which Dee would get this knowledge from the angels. And basically, Kelly would be, screeing and speaking out and channeling, as we would call it now, speaking in the Enochian language, giving all these things. There is a great deal of suggestion that Kelly was, in fact, an absolute charlatan who was simply milking this slightly gullible academic for everything he could get his hands on. And eventually they go off on a tour of Europe. Kelly also claimed to be able to actually, as an alchemist, to actually change base metals to gold. So loads of people were trying to grab him, including the Emperor Rudolph in Prague and King Stephen Bathory of Poland. They were convinced that they could use this angelic communication system, they could be able then to, convert base metals into gold and this, that, and the other. And it just goes on and on and on. Basically, they roam around Europe from one thing to another. I mean, Dee was a very religious man and a very devoutly religious man. So all of this, these connections with angels, particularly angels, were done within the confines of a theological practice, shall we say. So he believed in purity and study and things like this. But of course, Kelly was just interested in getting the money more and more. So if he could convince them that, he could swan around some European court claiming to be able to, increase, their gold reserves by chucking a bit of base metal in a pot and boiling it up, he would be happy to do that. Eventually, though, Kelly oversteps it a little bit because he tries to convince Dee that the angels have convinced him that monogamy is not what God intended, and that they should actually, between the two of them, mutually share their wives.
And now we come to it. It was always said in this way, wasn't it?
Now you got to remember, Dee had married again, to a lady much younger than myself. Jane Dee was only 34 at the time. Kelly was about 32 as well. Dee was 60. So the angels have really advised them that they ought to do this. So Dee is very reluctant, but he does go along with it. But eventually that brings down the collapse of the relationship. It all goes to down. So it caused a lot of anxious for him. And if it's funny enough that 9 months after they start this as well, Dee's son was born, who he baptized Theodorus Strabonius Dee and raised as his own, though it's probably more than likely it was Kelly's. So after that, after about 6 years of roaming around Europe, he goes back to Mortlake, which is where everything was based, to discover that his home has been vandalized, his library was ruined, all his prized books and instruments stolen. It's a very sad end, really.
Yeah.
Also, England had started to move against the occult practices, even though it accepted what it was perceived as white magic. Anything that they thought slipped into the dark side was not acceptable. So we became sober from that. Lost a lot of support, a bit of support from Elizabeth, who more or less sort of gave him a sort of, made him warden of Christ College in Manchester just to give him something to do. But when James I came along, that was it really. And he declined into 5 years in poverty in Mortlake, selling off his possessions just to support himself and his last daughter, Catherine. And he died in 1608 or 1609, remember the age. But yeah, a plaque was actually put up to him in the church in St Mary's the Virgin in Mortlake, and it was put up in 2013. He is still remembered. He's still
remembered. But
yes, it was a fascinating glimpse of the mindset of this period, if nothing else, because we think this sorcerer, this magician. Well, he's on the cusp of scientist. They didn't have that distinction. In fact, if you look at the work, I beg your pardon, if you look at the studies of Newton, a couple of centuries later, not a great deal of difference. Newton's alchemical studies and notebooks are still prevalent, and Newton was attempting to define the dimensions of the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, so there's not much
change.
No. But what we have here, by the way, that I put up on the screen while you were talking, it's a part of a larger painting showing Dee at the court of Elizabeth, but it's a 19th century painting, but it's fascinating that when they scanned it, they found underneath skulls surrounding Dee that the original artist had put in and then taken out because it was seen as not suitable maybe for a 19th century sort of mindset. But as far as we're concerned with John Dee, surely then it means, I'm thinking about the library at St Julian's, because if you're trying to copy the greatest bibliophile in the kingdom, your library is going to be pretty darn impressive, I think, at St Julian's. And also, Sir William Herbert did study alchemy and was after the philosopher's stone, so to speak. So the secret of alchemy, the elixir of life, all that sort of thing. Isn't it? There's a wonderful story when you mentioned one of Dee's children, one of his other ones, Arthur, who did actually grow up to be a very accomplished academic as well, is with Sir William Herbert's daughter Mary when they're kids, and they're playing out a sort of mock wedding. And John Dee says that, well, actually, the astrological, it looks quite good for them. Arthur Dee, though, did sort of blot his copybook in this anecdote by throwing a brickbat in the air and not getting out of the way as it landed. Now, I'm thinking...
apple in the barrel at that point.
No, not at that time, but it became pretty impressive later. So I'm thinking of this library of Sir William Herbert's, and this is where the great tragedy happens. You mentioned poisoned food.
Yes.
Because what happens was, this is a very inflexible man, as Dee was to a certain extent. Dee had very little humor, and Sir William Herbert was exactly the same. Very inflexible. He believed, by the way, that Raglan Castle belonged to him, not the other Herberts from a maternal line. He believed that Raglan should have been his. Yeah. And he always boasted. He said that he was, when one of the Morgans said that they were his equal, probably a Morgan of Llantarnum, he wrote, "I am heir in the blood of 10 earls and bear their several coats. Besides, he must be of the blood royal, for my grandfather Devereux, I am lineally and legitimately descended out of the body of Edward IV." And A.C. Rouse, in his in the book, The Elizabethan Renaissance, has a great line after quoting this letter. He says, "The reader may think all this very childish, but it is characteristic. All humans, in all places, and at all times, are children." Which I quite like that.
Yes, it is actually quite nice.
But the great tragedy is he's in his library at St Julian's, and he doesn't get cats to get rid of the rats. He uses poison. And he puts the poison on little cards, and they're in his library. Well, he's in his library working very hard, and his two young children, are playing in the library. They see the poison. They think it's sugared candy. They eat the poison, happily bounce up to their father, show him the card. He is absolutely horrified. He does everything he can, but both sons die.
Oh dear! I mean,
Poisoned
that's a shocker, isn't
to
it?
a great accidental tragedy at the library of St Julian's house.
Oh gosh! Oh,
So
gosh! Yeah. Oh,
it's
dear.
very sad, and indeed we've got a heartbreaking account actually of the effect of that. Inexpressible was the sorrow of the parents, lamentable were the cries of the servants, and condoling of the family and friends for this great loss, which in a special manner wrought upon their dear mother, that she was well nigh distracted to the day of her death. So devastating.
That's very, very sad.
All that was left for Sir William, who's on his dignity all the time, was the daughter Mary, who you might remember earlier on playing with little Arthur Brickbat D, as we'd like to call it. So Sir William made it. He said, well, you are not getting any of my lands in Ireland or any of my huge estates unless you marry someone named Herbert. Well, he dies in 1593, and poor Mary reaches the age of 21 without a suitable suitor, so to speak. And then finally, cometh the hour, cometh the man, over the hill, this Errol Flynn type character appears. Edward Herbert, a cousin from Montgomeryshire. And he really is an Errol Flynn. If ever a man deserves to have the accent of Leslie Phillips in a karaoke song, it is the man who marries Mary and saves the Herberts of St Julian's. There he is.
Oh, blimey, quite a catch. That's all I can say.
Absolutely a catch.
I love a man who can wear puffy trousers.
This is Sir Edward Herbert, who later becomes Lord Herbert of Cherbury, and an extraordinarily, by the way, this is actually a miniature by Isaac Oliver, and it's part of a cabinet which is at Powys Castle, another branch of Herbert's, and that was bought for the nation in 2017. This painting, £2.1 million it was bought for in 2017. It's an important person. Now, the symbiology is interesting here. We've got a spring, because of his spring of creativity. He was a poet, and also a very serious writer. There's this duality with this man. He's a hellraiser, Errol Flynn, but on the other hand, he is a respected, although he seems to have disappeared a bit today, a respected academic. For example, he is the man who wrote the first purely metaphysical treatise in English. He wrote a book called De Veritate, on truth, which basically they say he's the father of English deism.
Oh, gosh.
Now, without falling down a rabbit hole.
You wouldn't think that by looking at that very loose figure there, would you?
You would not.
I mean, you wouldn't think that.
Deism is essentially the rejection of revelation.
Yeah.
So he believed you can work with reason and come to the solution that there is a creator. But that does also mean that he doesn't believe in the segregation of religions as Christianity was carved up, which could get him into trouble, of course. He believes that all truth comes from within. And there is one universal truth. I mean, that's almost a little bit like John Dee in a certain way. You work with reason.
Sliding into Gnosticism, isn't it? There, really.
Yeah.
Well,
God doesn't care. God doesn't care what we believe necessarily. It's how we use our lives, that sort of thing. And he was close to Ben Jonson and very close to John Donne. So this is quite a serious character in that respect. But we've got he's ready for courtly life. We have a river here, which lets somebody to say that this was St. Julian's Wood, but I'm not sure that it is. I mean, it doesn't quite look the right landscape, does it? And on his shield, you've got a heart burning with fire, possibly for passion or an allegory almost about the immortal soul. And on it, you can see the words Magica sympathy.
Oh.
Magic of sympathy.
Or
the
sympathetic magic.
Yes.
Sympathetic magic is actually a form of magical practice.
There's some debate about
that's interesting, that one.
There's some debate about what it actually means, and whether it's to do with his philosophy or whether it's courtly love or all sorts of things like that. But by the way, he's on the banned books list for the Vatican. He was placed on the banned books list for his On Truth. Yeah. Now, he treated his wife pretty well. When he's at St Julian's, by the way, let's have a look at his mum, first of all, because she was quite important. His mum is almost, her name was Magdalene Newport, which is sort of looking into the future, his big estate in Newport that he inherited. And John Donne adored this woman and actually did the sermon at her funeral. And she was extremely big in, I love the painting, which is why I'm showing it.
It is smashing, isn't it?
Magdalene was, compare that to the one with Sir William Herbert, how basic that was compared to this. And Magdalene was a great influence on her sons, not just Edward, but also the famous poet George Herbert, who was the son of hers as well. So an important lady, but let's get back to Edward. There he is. Now we're going to look at his slightly more loose side now, because he was a little bit of a womanizer. Not initially. He and Mary had lots of children. And then one day, he said, first of all, he saved a man at St Julian's. He writes in his autobiography. He wrote an autobiography. About as accurate as Errol Flynn's autobiography, aptly. But at St Julian's, he's on his horse one day and he looks into the River Usk and he sees his servant on his horse being swept away by the River Usk. Without thinking of his own safety or his horse's, quite frankly, he charges into the river. A little bit like James Bond's Lotus Esprit entering the water in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Did his horse turn into a dolphin?
This amphibious horse. And he rescued him, and more importantly, both horses were safe. But he's also always doing things like that. So anyway, he says to his wife Mary one day, Mary, this huge estate that I've inherited in your name, why don't we pass it all straight on to our sons? Don't know what his plan was here, but Mary says, well, no, I'm still alive. I don't think I need to pass all my land and estates, lose all my power by passing them on to our sons. So Edward then says, well, I tell you what then, I need to see the world. I haven't seen the world. I've got to go away. I've got to go away. But if you pass the estate on to our sons, I will never leave your side. And Mary's response was, goodbye then. And Edward leaves St Julian's and he heads off to court, where Elizabeth I says of him that it's such a shame he married so young.
Oh my gosh.
James I's Queen, Anne of Denmark, was very close to him as well. It said 3 queens had their eyes on Edward, who by now is called Lord Herbert of Cherbury. That was the title he was given. He's also getting into all kinds of scrapes. A Scottish usher who snatched a ribbon from Molly Middleton's hair, he immediately hit him and started a brawl and was about to have a duel in Hyde Park before the Privy Council intervened to stop it. Sir John Eyre found things a little suspicious when he found his wife clutching a miniature like this one next to her heart of Edward. So he decided, it's interesting, he writes about this, somewhere near a place called Scotland Yard, he writes, 4 men ambushed me and attempted to murder me. But he describes the violence like a cartoon. At one point, Edward says, and at that point, a dagger was stuck into me, which a gentleman later took out. And Edward says he beat all of them. And there are lots of stories of him in his nightshirt diving through windows and all sorts of things. So he is our Errol Flynn. But incredibly, they made him ambassador to Paris. So he's a big name, and he tried to set up the marriage of the future King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. So this is quite a famous figure, Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury. And so many people don't know that his home for a spell was St Julian's house.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
In Newport, buddies with Ben Jonson and John Donne, and they do poems for him and all sorts. Incredible person. During the Civil War, however, he decided that he would sort of, be on the fence a bit. He didn't answer Charles I's call. He went to Montgomery Castle and pled. He said he was ill, didn't want to get involved. In the end, Parliament took his castle and gave him, but kept his library, which he was worried about losing. And we all know what happened to Raglan Castle's library.
Yeah, quite, yeah.
And Parliament gave him £20 a year, £20 a week, pension, and he had a house in London. Now, I don't think he's sitting necessarily on the fence because of his library. Remember his religious beliefs. The Civil War's becoming more and more a religious conflict, and he doesn't really agree with either side.
No.
So I wonder if that played.
No, he steps aside from it. That's fascinating, isn't it?
And he was in his 60s anyway, and he died in 1648. His son was a royalist, so he took over. This is his son Richard, 2nd Lord Herbert of Cherbury. He was governor of Newport in 1645. So when King Charles I rolls up in 1645 after the Battle of Naseby, this is the royalist governor of Newport at the time. He didn't get much from his father in the will. He's expecting great things. Apart from the title and some of the estates, his father left him his horses, amphibious part submarine horses, of course. And his wife got his collection of lutes, because Edward was a very great lutenist. And you can actually see his music, his lute music continues to this day. But when you're expecting great wealth and you get given a few horses and some lutes, it's not quite the same, is it?
No.
Now, the last of this great Herbert line, they always made fun of this man's weight, so I'm not going to do so. The last one to really own St Julian's house was Henry IV, Lord Herbert of Cherbury. There he is.
Oh.
And this is
Bless his
flattering.
little heart. The chubby little cheeks on him.
Fine. And then in 1772, the property gets bought by Charles Van of Llanwern, who's popped up in these podcasts. Didn't like the Americans, if you remember rightly.
Yeah.
And then in the night, and to see the state it's in after that, we've got an image of it in 1800. This is St Julian's house in 1800.
Oh yes, I've seen that.
So clearly this has been knocked down, rotted away. They've still got, again, very fashionable, the 2-story porch with the Herbert crest. And we have a reverse view down to the River Usk.
Yeah.
And again, it's a bit battered, as you can see, but they're clearly living in one part of it. It's become a farmhouse by this point, rather than a...
I was wondering if it had... We've seen that a number of times, haven't we? These manor properties wind up as sort of farmhouses.
Yeah, rather than...
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Rather than the venerable mansion, it was called at one time, but it's clearly seen better days here. In the 1860s, Octavius Morgan, the local antiquarian who lived at the Friars, which is now part of the Royal Gwent Hospital complex, said it's a terrible shame that really only the porch of the original mansion. It was hard to find what of the original Herbert mansion was still there. So the porch became this big thing that there is someone in the porch, you can see there.
Oh, yes.
He's sitting there. I don't know who he is or what he's waiting for.
Yeah.
But the place has seen better days, hasn't it? By this time. And of course, when you've got an estate, usually about 200 acres, you wait for one of the great estates in the 19th century to hoover it up, don't you? And that's what happened. The Duke of Beaufort bought it in the 19th century. And that's why you've got a sort of a Beaufort Road in St Julian's to this day. The Duke of Beaufort bought it up. And it continues sort of rotting away in a way until the Railway King bought it at auction. In 1869, he bought the St Julian's estate for £38,000, and his name was Joseph Furbank. And this is a wonderful photograph of Joseph Furbank. This photograph was found by a chap who gave a talk for the Durham Rotary, I think. And this chap, this is Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
The age of 7, he was sent to work at the collieries.
Oh, good Lord.
And yet he went to school in the evening as well.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
And through sheer hard work and bloody-mindedness, Joseph Furbank became known as the Railway King. He was a railway contractor, and he did about, I think, close to 50 lines, railway lines. He did a lot of work for the Midland Railway. And he decided to move to Newport and buy St Julian's when in 1854, the canal company was replacing a lot of the canals and tramways with passenger railways.
Oh,
and
right.
he got the license for Newport and to maintain the lines as well. So Furbank rolls in, and he thinks, well, maybe old St Julian's house could be good for one of the family, and he rebuilt it until it looked like that.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So Furbank has
You just see the remains, that little bit of the porch in there.
Yes.
And the plaque about it's the only bit that's left, more or less, from the house.
Well, this is it, isn't it? How much of the original is left? Probably not much, but he's rebuilt it. And there was a St Julian's brickworks, which a Furbank ran in the area. And he lived there for a while. But as for the main Furbank man, Joseph Furbank himself, he built in 1880 a new mansion. And the new mansion, which you can see them parked outside of there, was where Heather Road now is. So you had two St Julians at the time.
Oh, right.
The old St Julian's of the Herberts, the new Furbank mansion, which became known as Upper St Julian's. Bears in mind that old P.G. Wodehouse line, doesn't it, when he's held by his German hosts in the Second World War in Upper Silesia. And Woodhouse says, well, if this is Upper Silesia, I dread to think what Lower Silesia looked like. And so Upper St. Julian's, and then the old Herbert's house was sort of Lower St. Julian's or Old St. Julian's. Although it says there it's Newport Pass, that wonderful site, the image is actually from the South Wales Daily News. And again, it's not in a bad state now after the Furbank rebuilding, is it really?
Yeah.
So he does pretty well. When he dies, Joseph Furbank, and we've got a photograph of his imposing grave at St Woolas Cemetery in Newport. So he became a real Newportian. He was MP and things like that. Sir Thomas Furbank, another MP, took over, his son. And it's not him I'm going to concentrate on. It's his wife.
Oh, yeah.
There she is. This is Harriet. Oh. How grand. Lady Furbank.
Yeah.
Harriet Lady Furbank. And the reason I like her is, remember the last one, Goff, where you talked about sort of the medicines of the day?
Oh, yes.
You know, we had poor unfortunate poisoning in our last Capel Hanbury Lee. Well, this lady, Lady Furbank, loved Formamint lozenges. She was convinced that every time she almost had the flu, she would suck one of these Formamint lozenges and it would cure her. She said it was something like a miracle. And so you had articles for Formamint, which had basically 0.01 gram of formaldehyde, lactose sugar and everything else. Suck on one of these. And in the newspapers, it always had testimonials from Lady Furbank. She loved them. She's probably sucking on a Formamint in this picture, quite frankly.
Yeah. What is interesting about this period is that where today we're used to celebrity endorsement.
That's what it is.
The best way, if you had anything in this period and you wanted an endorsement, you got a lady or gentleman of quality to come in and do it. And there's I think it's in the Gondoliers by Gilbert and Sullivan. There's a whole section where two of the characters make a fortune out of actually promoting products and sponsorship deals with companies and stuff. So again, she's part of that that culture of promotion of things at the time. Where if you, a lady of quality.
She absolutely is. I particularly like this advert. Why catch their influenza? Formamint, the germ-killing throat tablet. So I like that. But if you look who the chair of who the president of Formamint is. The Viscountess Rhondda.
Oh gosh!
Formamint was one of the many companies that Lady Rhondda was in charge of. So that's keeping it local as well, isn't it? No wonder Formamint.
Chairman of the Viscountess Rhondda. Good Lord.
Now, once Sir Thomas died in 1910, Lady Furbank went on another few years into the 1920s. A bit of a cult author, was actually really the person who inherited the estate in a way. And it's St Julian's is what he always put as his address, even though he lived all over Europe and in London. On his passport, it says St Julian's. And that's the author Ronald Furbank, who you see.
Oh gosh, yes.
That's why you've got Ronald Road.
Isn't it funny? I've heard of Ronald Furbank, and I never associated him with the Railway King Furbank. Isn't that ridiculous?
Well, you wouldn't.
They never put them in the same place.
They were rather disparate characters. Ronald Furbank was a sort of a cult author in a way. Early comic novels, which he paid to publish himself, but he was in this very, very much inspired by Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley in the 1890s. Yeah. He was an aesthete, and but a great eccentric. I mean, by the way, his books were later championed by Evelyn Waugh, W.H. Auden. He's one of Stephen Fry's favorite authors today, but Furbank isn't read widely. So he's still a little bit of a cult to this day. But he's quite a character. So he goes around you, but he's so self-conscious and he is so nervous. He famously, during the dinner party, spent the entire dinner party hiding under the table.
Oh, gosh.
Osbert Sitwell decided he wanted to win over Furbank and invited him out. And Furbank actually said yes for a change. And Furbank put an enormous spread of food in front of him because I don't think he knew what Furbank liked. Furbank spent the whole time giggling, turning side on, and for politeness, ate a single grape. He did, however, like alcohol and cannabis a little bit more than he did eating. To give an idea of some of the stuff he wrote, just to give a little idea, if anyone here has not heard of Ronald Furbank, 2 quotes which I think sum up his work. He wrote these in his various novels. "The world is so disgracefully managed, one hardly knows to whom to complain." That was his. And one I particularly like, he puts it in a lady's mouth. "I am always disappointed with mountains. There are no mountains in the world as high as I should wish. They irritate me invariably. I should like to shake Switzerland."
Brilliant line.
So this is the admittedly very odd Ronald Furbank, but he did have talent, and he was quite proud. He was a great fan of Lord Herbert of Cherbury, of Edward Herbert's works. So when he first came to Newport, he was disappointed to see St Julian's house in such a state, which was quite sad. But that's why we've got Ronald Road. He also had an unrequited love for Evan Morgan of Tredegar House, who Furbank believed must have been the reincarnation of Ramesses. So a very
I remember that story.
Strange sort of character. He also gave the land for the St Julius and St Aaron's Church, which is there to this day in St Julian's Avenue, and he paid for a large crucifix to go outside. So if I can find it. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, here we go. There we are. We're in St Julian's Avenue. We're looking up at St Julius and St Aaron's Church, which Ronald Furbank gave the site, and there is actually a big crucifix up there, and he paid for that as well.
Oh, right.
This is the church that has bits of the old St Julius Chapel.
Oh, right.
It's turned into a barn, so we have that.
Interesting. It is a very unusual structure, that. I don't think I've actually seen that.
Yeah, the original plan was much grander. They wanted a basilica. It was going to be an enormously grand church. But I guess the death of the Furbanks... Ronald Furbank was dead at 40 in 1926. He was never going to live very long. He was very frail at the best of times. There's also a Heather Road in St Julian's, and that comes from Ronald's sister, Heather Furbank, who we'll just have a little look at here as we chug towards the end. This is Heather. Heather Furbank never married, but she enjoyed buying clothes. And when her days of great society were over, she carefully packed away these clothes, and so they survived. So when she died in 1954, an extraordinary collection of clothes was inherited by her nephew, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Furbank. And so the V&A had them, and they founded the foundation. They formed the foundation of the Victoria and Albert's 20th century clothing collection.
Oh, blimey.
So she loved dressing up, but kept them rather than threw them aside. So we've got, I'm out of my league here, Goff. I was all right with deism, but I'm in over my head now.
Yeah.
I will say, for those who know more about fashion than me and Goff, I have got a list here of who... Oh, I thought I had. Oh, yes. Some of the designers that she had were Lucille. Now, I know that's Lady Duff Gordon. I know that much. Redfern and Sons, Frederick Bosworth, Russell and Allen, and Kate Riley. That'll mean something to people who are far more knowledgeable about fashion of the period. But these continue, and I do love the Cecil Beaton portrait photograph of someone wearing, a model wearing in the 60s, one of Heather Furbank's dresses.
Oh.
It's all very My Fair Lady, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? Yes. Oh, yeah. It's not being interesting. You wonder if that was the inspiration for that famous racecourse sequence within the film My Fair Lady. Because again, the black and white and the very Edwardian look. Oh, well, I remember.
Yeah, so
we're going to Heather Furbank.
Heather Road, I think anyone who walks down Heather Road in Newport, it's a very long road, needs to dress something like that, quite frankly. Well, they're disgracing the name of Heather Furbank.
Yeah.
By the death of Ronald, really, the money was sort of drying up, so things had to go, including, great photograph this. This is Heather Road, and it shows the old Furbank mansion, about to be demolished in 1933, and this is one of the new homes that's just been built right next to it.
Oh, good Lord.
They've still got the sort of, boarded and stickered. So that was knocked down in 1933.
Good Lord.
It was only put up in 1880.
Well, yeah, it didn't last very long at all, did it? 50 years.
But old St Julian's continued. And this is another wonderful photograph. Now, this was put on the Pictures and Memories of Newport Facebook page, which is a great group to join, by Claire J. Chappell. And it's of the Eaton family, who lived at Old St Julian's 1914 to 1920. And they had their business in Duckpool Road. Yeah. And there they all are. And it's clearly still the porch, isn't it?
Oh, well, yes. Yeah, you can still see it behind the Herbert.
I think that's a wonderful photograph.
Yeah.
But we're already feeling as we end up here that the house after this, and after the Furbanks left town, was just left.
Yeah.
Once the Furbanks weren't around. M.J. Waterhouse and H.B. Waterhouse, it say in 1974, St. Julian's was in a deplorable state. There were no floors, so there was a drop into the cellar, no windows, no doors. And apparently it's being used as a car park and a dump. It is highly dangerous. Yeah. In 1955, which we think was the last time it was lived in, Fred Hando writes, "The mansion has disappeared, and St. Julian's is but a sad relic of the days when the Herberts had their house on the riverbank, their vast estates, including a deer park, St. Julian's Wood, and their own track leading towards Newport, where stood their picturesque townhouse, now misnamed the Murringer's House."
Oh, right. So that was the Herbert family's townhouse. Oh, gosh.
It then became a garage. It was a garage for a while. People might remember in the 70s, it was converted into a garage. And then in 1980, it was finally demolished. And you saw it as it is now with Marina Court on the site of that old.
Yeah. There was a kerfuffle about the demolition of St. Julian's, wasn't it? Because it happened more or less the night before. It could have got a protected.
Yeah, there is something in that. It used to be on a supplementary list, which meant a house important but not important enough to be listed. And I believe they were going to put it onto the main list. Yeah. And it was an overnight sort of job, I think, to destroy.
Oh, yeah.
It was clearly
more
a
or less
death trap,
the day before.
But the timing was unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm telling you, say Dr. D may have said it was auspicious.
Almost certainly. So that was St. Julian's. That was quite a nice little gallop.
Well, I'm fascinated. Here. I didn't realize. I'm fascinated how many of the people we've come across in our area of the world have been so important nationally. That's quite incredible. You tend to think of them very much as being, local aristocracy for local people, and then because they're really right up there in the top of court structures and court life and academic studies and all sorts of things. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, Lord Herbert of Cherbury is certainly a name you still find in libraries. Father of English deism. But yeah, all very interesting. But we've gone on longer than we normally do. So we shall end it there. But thank you very much, Goff. And I hope you'll join us next time for our next one. So thank you for listening.
Bye then. Bye.
Bye-bye.